Hey there, my name's Cameron and welcome to The Forum, the Canadian news show dedicated to conversation. I want to start off with this show by apologizing for the lateness of the weekend show. We've got a lot of news to run through today, so let's get right to it, shall we? For our first story today, we're going to take a look back at Ontario politics, everyone's favorite subject, and talk a bit about Doug Ford, the PC candidate. Last Monday, Ford did a trip through Ontario's wine country, and while he was there, he talked a bit about business and income taxes. In a statement to the news, Doug Ford said, quote, "The honeymoon is over when it comes to companies getting government cash in Ontario. It's not fair that some companies enjoy financial assistance from taxpayers while others don't." Ford, who has promised to cut corporate income taxes from 11.5% to 10.5%, said, quote, "Instead of picking winners and losers, we're going to lower business taxes for everyone. We're going to stabilize business hydro rates, we're going to cut red tape, and we're going to bring good jobs back home. If we're going to give incentives to anyone, we're going to give incentives to the companies here in Ontario, rather than benefiting our US neighbors, our US companies that are taking your jobs." The Liberals said in a statement that Ford should tread carefully when it comes to cutting things that critics call corporate welfare, maintaining that such government-business partnerships have helped create 1 million jobs since 2003. Now, I have two opinions when it comes to this story. Firstly, I agree with Ford that we need to give incentives to Ontario businesses. I think that local businesses are key to combating large multinational corporations, which I am personally not a fan of. Where I don't agree with Ford is his stance on business taxes and his opinion on how the government should affect the market. In Ford's statement, he said that the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers, so he'll be cutting income taxes for all corporations. The issue that I take with this move is it assumes that the markets are a level playing field, which in my opinion, they're just not. If you look to business ownerships and especially company ownership, you'll see that there are very few parent companies that have so many subsidiaries that for a local provincial business, you have a lot of very tough competition. So I think it's impossible to have a truly free market if you don't give small independent companies the chance to compete. Now you can do this either through government incentives to the little guys, or through steeper taxes on larger corporations. And while some, and especially Ford in this case, see that as picking winners and losers, I see that as actually leveling the playing field. But I don't know. Is Ford right by saying that the government shouldn't be picking winners and losers in the market? Is it better to incentivize small businesses or to tax the larger ones? If you're in favor of small businesses, I certainly see the benefit of having large corporations. They give millions of jobs. However, is there a limit to how good corporations are? Whatever your opinion is, I want to hear it in the comments down below. Next, we have to address the mess that's going on in Palestine and Israel right now. As you may or may not know, on Monday, the United States moved their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and recognized Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. If you're not well versed in the conflict between Palestine and Israel, as I was, I'm going to put a link in the description to a video by Vox that breaks down how complicated this conflict actually is. But what you need to know for this story is that Jerusalem, the holy city of Christians, Jews, and Muslims, has been claimed by both Palestine and Israel. However, the UN indicated Jerusalem as a neutral city that would be owned by neither party. So when President Trump moved his embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and said that the United States now recognizes Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel, it angered the hell out of some Palestinians. An ensuing protest and riot broke out on the border between Israel and Gaza, and 50 Palestinians were gunned down by the Israel military. As that brings us to today, when Palestinian diplomats thanked Canada's government for not attending the opening of the American embassy in Jerusalem. The spokesman for Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland said that Canada wasn't even on the guest list for the opening of the embassy in Jerusalem. Quote, "It was a bilateral event between the US and Israel, and we were not invited." Now Canada, along with its major allies like France and Britain, does not support the US embassy's move to Jerusalem, saying that that's a decision for future peace agreements between the Palestinians and Israelis. Now Israel blames Hamas for inciting the violence that took place on the Israel-Gaza border, a position that the ambassador to Canada then maintained. Ambassador Nimrod Barkin said that Hamas is a terrorist organization that is trying to, quote, hijacked the future of the Palestinian people for its own nefarious ambition. But the Palestinian delegation in Ottawa said that the US embassy move was, quote, unilateral and illegal. And Israel's military response to the protesters was, quote, an immoral act that relied on excessive force. Furthermore, the Palestinian delegation said, quote, those shocking and bloody images can't leave us without welcoming the decision of the Government of Canada and other governments who didn't participate in the so-called inauguration ceremony of the US on Palestinian land. On Monday, Foreign Affairs Minister Freeland tweeted that the violence against civilians, journalists, and children was, quote, inexcusable. She said that all parties have the responsibility to protect civilians. Like any international issue, I think that this goes beyond any simple answer and solution. The issue is just too ingrained at this point to be simply fixed. And that's how I see the president's move as. It's a simple solution to this very complicated problem that won't work. And while I don't support the extremists that belong to Hamas in any way, I can understand why Palestinians would be pissed off enough to protest. And I also agree with our Foreign Affairs Minister in her condemnation of Israel's use of military force. In short, I don't think that Trump, Hamas, or the Israeli government are doing the right things to gain peace, because they seem to me like simple solutions to a very complicated problem. But what do I know? Maybe Trump and his direct action is actually doing something for a change, which could bring this international issue to an end. Maybe the stand-by approach that we've seen foreign governments take, such as our own, is only hurting the Palestinians and Israelis more. And this is where I'll turn it off to you. If you have any opinions, this is a really complicated topic, and I don't know many people that are well versed in it. But whatever your opinion is, I'd like to see it in the comments down below. And for our final story today, we need to talk about the Transmountain Pipeline between Alberta and British Columbia. Now, the Transmountain Pipeline already exists. If you don't know anything about it, you should know that. It spans from around Edmonton to Burnaby, BC. The pipeline, which had already existed, was bought by Kinder Morgan in 2003. And in 2016, the government okayed a project to allow Kinder Morgan to expand their pipeline and the system's capacity to 890,000 barrels a day, which would mean over 400 tar sands tankers traveling through the different inlets in BC. Now, a few weeks back, the company announced that it would be suspending all non-essential activities in regards to the $7.4 billion pipeline expansion. It said it would still try to obtain agreements that would allow the project to proceed, but it would have to do so by May 31st, or, quote, it is difficult to conceive of any scenario in which we would proceed. Now, the British Columbian NDP Premier John Horgan said in a press conference in Victoria that the protests and demonstrations are having a very big toll on Kinder Morgan. Direct quote from John Horgan. Although it did not come up in the conversation, investors at Kinder Morgan have to be moved by the passion of British Columbians that are emerging in many dozens to be arrested on a daily basis. The determination of the Indigenous leaders here in British Columbia to protect the Bird Inlet, the Salish Sea, and the economy that depends on that. Now, Kinder Morgan's move to suspend operations on the project would be seen as a blow to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who has insisted that this pipeline be built. Meanwhile, BC opposition Andrew Wilkinson said in a tweet that British Columbia is now engaged in a trade war with Alberta. So what will the major players in this deal want? Now, there's Kinder Morgan, and they want less risk. This meaning less risk from the government impeding their progress. They want to ensure that they'll be able to finish and maintain this pipeline, and that it won't pose a risk to the shareholders. And BC is the biggest threat to this. Then there's BC, who also wants less risk, but less risk in terms of environmental impact. They want to ensure that any pipeline expansion would be safe for the environment, and as it stands right now, they don't see that happening. Premier Horgan is actually trying to find ways within the justice system to limit the amount of oil that can leave the inlet per day. Then there's Alberta, who wants to have their resources just open to the market, and as much of that resource as possible. You know, bigger pipeline allows for more access to Alberta oil. And then there's Ottawa, who wants all provincial resources to be accessed by the global markets, and so a pipeline like this would be very important to that agenda. Now, the opposition, BC and the environmental groups it's working with, has two main points. The first one being that the pipeline could cross through communities, rivers, and other public places that can leave them vulnerable to toxic spills. And this is not to mention the threat of a marine oil spill due to the number of tankers that would be going through the inlets. And their second point, which is that because Canada's elected officials refuse to clamp down on greenhouse gas industries such as the oil sands, they also can't do that for other big greenhouse gas producing industries for fear of double standard. Now that brings us to today, where the Saskatchewan Premier, Scott Moe, is actually calling on the Prime Minister to get tough with British Columbia. Now, Moe says that Justin Trudeau's Liberal government should actually suspend funding for BC's infrastructure if it refuses to comply. Moe says that it's been a month since Trudeau met with Horgan of BC and Notley of Alberta, and that the federal government has not introduced any legislature to get the project built. Speaking in Calgary, Trudeau said that he's already looking into different legislative, legal, and financial avenues to get this already federally approved project built. Now, I don't even know where to begin with a story like this. First off, I find it simply absurd that the leaders of BC and Alberta, which are both NDP, have resorted to such extreme measures to get these negotiations done. Now, regarding the pipeline itself, I find myself on a middle ground, where I worry about the economy as well as the environment in equal ways. Now, the world still relies on oil, so the pipeline is necessary. Now, is the expansion necessary, and is the size of this expansion necessary? I don't know. I think there needs to be a balance between economic and environmental needs when it comes to situations like this. Now, as for the strategy that the Saskatchewan Premier is suggesting, I'm not too sure about it. To me, it seems like it would increase tensions in BC rather than make BC concede. Now, remember, the Premier of BC only has to hold out until the 31st of May for Kinder Morgan to back off on this pipeline. But I'm not very well versed in inter-provincial politics, so I'd like to hear from you guys. What is your opinion of the pipeline expansion? Is it truly necessary? Should the environment be the priority here? Should the economy? What about the politics surrounding it? Should the Prime Minister take action against British Columbia and John Horgan? Or are Notley and Trudeau in the wrong for pushing this pipeline so hard when obviously the people there don't want it? Whatever your thoughts are, throw them in the comments. And that's where I'm going to end today's show. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.